Hello, class. My name is Trey Strube, and welcome to my case study presentation. Let's get started. The topic of my presentation is Land Development Code amendments in the city of Tarpon Springs. My first reading agenda item was Ordinance 2022-24, Hurricane Shelter Impact and Coastal High Hazard Area Development. I started my project by contacting Irene Jacobs, the city clerk of Tarpon Springs. Ms. Jacobs provided me with the first read agenda items and put me in contact with members of the Planning and Zoning Board to learn more about the topic. Expert interviews. I met Patricia McNeese, who is the principal planner for the city. Ms. McNeese sent me all the information regarding the agenda item. I met with my experts on August 21st at 5:45 at the Tarpon Springs City Hall, located at 324 Pine Street. The City Hall is a historic building and was the original Tarpon Springs High School, which was built in 1926. I interviewed Ms. McNeese and Allie Keene. Ms. Keene is a senior planner with the city. The experts provided me with the background information regarding the agenda item and answered all of my questions. The key points of our interview are as follows. The county manages hurricane shelters for each city, and the city is included in the county hazard mitigation plan. The ordinance calls for government data only regarding mitigation. Under the current ordinance, national private data was allowed, which could be skewed for developers as they often seek the least costly methods for mitigation. There will be increased cost to developers, but the buildings will be more resilient. Population growth was not a factor in these changes, and the city uses data from the Bureau of Economic and Business Research regarding population. The coastal high hazard area is modified every 4 to 5 years as needed. There are no design restrictions currently in the coastal high hazard area for the city of Tarpon. Areas that are designated historic are exempt by FEMA. There is not any expected opposition to the changes to the Land Development Code, as the current Board of Commissioners wants changes and more restrictions. Ms. McNeese explained that a couple of years prior, the Board of Commissioners lowered shelter impact study threshold numbers for a large apartment project in the city to the dismay of many residents. The new Board Commissioners members wanted to change the threshold numbers and make them stricter than before. Ms. McNeese and Ms. Keene went over the coastal high hazard area map with me. After my interviews, I attended the Planning and Zoning Board meeting on September 21st at 6:30. Ms. McNeese introduced me to the members of the board and the city attorney, Regina Kardash. The city attorney explained to me the difference between an ordinance and a resolution and how it would affect enforcement of the new provisions for shelter mitigation. During the meeting, they let me sit up front with the board. I have attached a photo below. It was a great experience to meet all of them and see how they work. Background information. The city of Tarpon Springs is mainly historic buildings. Let's take a quick look at the map of the buildings. The changes to the code provide exemptions for historic buildings, and as you can see, most of the buildings were built prior to 1945. The city is coastal, and approximately 70% of it is located within the coastal high hazard area. The CHHA is defined as an area particularly vulnerable to the effects of coastal flooding from tropical storm events and is defined by Section 163.31782 H9 Florida statutes as the area below the elevation of a Category 1 storm surge line as established by a sea, lake, and overland surges from hurricanes, the SLOSH computerized storm surge model. Here's a map of the Tarpon Springs, the city of Tarpon Springs and the affected area within the CHHA. As you can see in the photo, almost the entire city is within this area. Ordinance 2022-24. The changes to the Land Development Code include basing shelter impact studies on government-based data instead of private data, requiring developers to provide a shelter analysis based upon a Category 3 hurricane impact on all residential developments of 10 or more units. The study must provide solutions for mitigation where shelter deficits are projected. The solutions are subject to review by the Pinellas County Emergency Management and include things like providing private structures for shelter space and elevating the roads as well as other improvements to the road. The ordinance provides a shelter mitigation fee that can be paid to the city in lieu of a shelter based on current building fees for a storm shelter. The ordinance provides coastal high hazard area development regulations, including raising the base flood elevation to 3 feet over minimum FEMA base flood elevation and increasing the wind zone risk category to the next higher category within the building code. The resolution includes a list of required design features for CHHA development that are based on the required measures of St. Petersburg, but they've been adjusted by the Planning and Zoning Department to reflect the population and the development of Tarpon. 4-step policy analysis. The issue. The city of Tarpon Springs is located mostly within the coastal high hazard area. The city wants to lower the threshold numbers for hurricane shelter impact studies for developers and increase its resiliency to coastal storms. The city is susceptible to flooding, and the community wants higher standards on base flood elevation and wind mitigation for future developments. The stakeholders. Mayor Costa Vaticiotis. The mayor supports the changes and wants the ordinance approved. The mayor agrees with the Planning and Zoning Board members, and he wants developers to be held to a stricter standards regarding development within the CHHA. Vice Mayor Lunt. He supports the changes to the Land Development Code. He did not want any provisions that allowed developers to buy their way out of the mitigative measures, which is that fee, the fee that we were talking about earlier. They can pay into that fee instead of having a shelter. He did not want that at all. He thought the 2 items listed in section 122.12c should be mandatory, and those items were the road improvements and elevation, which we spoke about earlier, and I also spoke to the board in my presentation. Commissioner Eisner. He supports some of the changes, but wanted a workshop on the ordinance. He prefers to see it go back to the Planning and Zoning Board, but he ultimately agreed that the changes were better than having nothing. Commissioner Koulias. He wants to see the resolution measures implemented and possibly added to the building code. He is also one that wanted to see the threshold numbers lowered even more than what the ordinance, what the proposed changes were suggesting. Commissioner Koulianos. He wanted more scrutiny on the development within the CHHA for safety, and he wanted the resolution items to be included within the ordinance. Developers. They want the lowest development costs and the least restrictions on building in the CHHA. The Live Local Act provides tax breaks, land use and zoning benefits that will increase development in Florida that was passed by Governor DeSantis. And this is a concern of the board, concern of the community. Citizens of Tarpon Springs. The community needs a hurricane shelter or provisions put in place in lieu of a shelter. They seek more resiliency and safety provisions for their families and homes. Most of the residents support these changes, and many residents are concerned over the flooding in the city that we just saw with Hurricane Idalia. Pinellas County Emergency Management. The county has not designated any hurricane shelters within the city. Tarpon Springs Middle School was the only listed hurricane shelter for the whole city, and Pinellas County Emergency Management removed it in 2021. The coastal vulnerability of the city within the CHHA makes designating a shelter there difficult. The Planning and Zoning Department. Ms. Vincent is the director of the department, and she thought these changes should be the bare minimum and that we cannot stop development within the CHHA. Every board member I met on the planning board supported the ordinance, and they all wanted to see the resolution items in the ordinance and not as a resolution, because it cannot be enforced as if it were an ordinance. Recommendation. My recommendation is that the Board of Commissioners approves the changes to the Land Development Code. The listed resolution items are added to the Building Code or Land Development Code to increase the city's resiliency. They should lower the threshold numbers for hurricane shelter impact studies because future developments will likely be smaller in size because of the population of the city and the relatively small parcels that are still available for development. Let's take a look at the video of my speech to the board.
Good evening. My name is Trey Strube. I live at 12924 Buckhorn Drive in Hudson. I'm a student in the Public Policy and Administration program at St. Petersburg College. I've spent a lot of time at the Tarpon Springs campus, and I'm here tonight to voice my support for ordinance number 2022-24. This semester, I'm working on a case study project involving hurricane shelter mitigation in Tarpon Springs. The proposed changes to the Land Development Code will provide the city with the best data sources to make emergency management decisions and increase its preparedness for coastal storms, as well as future environmental changes. The lowered thresholds on hurricane shelter impact studies are an important change because of the vulnerability of the city being mostly located within the coastal high hazard area. As coastal storms become more frequent, I think it's essential that we hold future developers to this higher standard regarding shelter mitigation. I watched a prior Board of Commissioners meeting from back in December where the lack of a hurricane shelter in the city was being discussed and how the solutions listed under section 122.12c could be utilized. I think these provisions listed under numbers 8 and 9 would be beneficial in lieu of a shelter, as road elevation and improvements would benefit the community if evacuation were to become necessary. The changes to the base flood, elevation, and wind zone risk categories will lessen potential losses after a storm and help property owners with insurance costs. I had the opportunity to attend the last Planning and Zoning Board meeting, and there was concern expressed over those design options listed in the resolution. Ms. Cardass said it much better than I could, but I wanted to recommend that those measures are included in the ordinance or somewhere within the building code, as it would increase the resiliency of the city against coastal storms and projected sea level rises. The addition of the listed items would assist the community in recovering from coastal storms and ensure that infrastructure remains functional. According to the Pinellas County Local Mitigation Strategy, every dollar invested in mitigation saves a Pinellas County community an average of $6 in recovery. The proposed changes to the Land Development Code will benefit the community and may set an example for other coastal cities to adopt these similar design standards. In closing, I hope that the board approves these proposed changes to the code and that it includes those mitigative measures as well. And I wanted to thank Patricia McNeese and Irene Jacobs for helping with my project, and I thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
The results of the Board of Commissioners meeting was that there was a motion to approve ordinance 2022-24, subject to 3 amendments, which were to include the resolution in the ordinance, an amendment to review mitigative measures in-house by Tarpon Springs if approved by the county, and removal of payment into the mitigative fund by developers, which several of the board members did not want included in the ordinance. All of the members voted yes to approve with those amendments, and resolution 2023-26 was voted down because they decided to include that within the ordinance. Overall, it was a great experience working on this project, and I appreciate everybody's time. I hope they enjoyed it.